Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video, and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on spirituality, and I suppose what I'd like to say about spirituality is just honestly my perspective on it. And I'm not going to say that, barring a discussion on religion, because that's a can of worms I don't want to get into, I'm just going to say this, that I think spirituality is something that is a consequence of certain factors of human cognition, primarily because people are social creatures. A lot of our neurobiology exists for us to be able to interpret and intuit the motivations, preferences, even temperamental variances of other people. And because we're like this, we're made in some ways to understand personhood or persona, and that's very important for us, and it's something we keep track of in an environment because we have to judge and evaluate one another. And because we're like this, we care about concepts like fairness or reciprocity and various things like that. And so human relationality is somewhat transactional, not completely transactional. You care about a person because you want to keep track of a person and you want to know who that person is in relationship to yourself. And that's the ways in which we first began understanding things in the world, because that's how we understand one another. And that's also why we're empathic, because we have to be able to intuit what may occur, because hell, if you don't, people can take advantage of you. And so we have the capacity for empathy, and we're concerned with persona or personhood in terms of how it affects us and it relates to us. Well, when we pay attention to the world, our brains do not run, let's just say, new games in terms of trying to understand, what our actions do and what's going on with the system. Nature is conservative, first and foremost. It is not interested in inventing like 1,001 new things. And something that's very interesting about nature in terms of its organization, human beings and their ideas included, is that patterns tend to repeat themselves throughout a tier of resolution. So those are called fractals, and it's not the way nature literally organizes itself in terms of whenever you're looking at a leaf, but it is the case that there's roughly the same repeating pattern up a tier of resolution. And so when I say a tier of resolution, I mean you go from a fundamental building block up to the most complicated expression of that structure. You can think of starting at roots, moving up a stem, and then you have a flower or something like that. I don't know. But it's not even like that, quite honestly. It's like But the point I'm trying to make is that it's emergent. It's emergent. Ideas are emergent. They're very much emergent phenomenon like anything else, and it's the case that there's a bottom to the whole landscape of ideation. And this is what Carl Jung was trying to key in on when he was talking about the collective unconscious. There's some place that all ideas freaking come from, man. They don't just spin out of the void, And there is a reason why human beings in particular have those ideas. Because if you were to play this game with a cat or a dog or something like that, if dogs were to come up with gods or something like that, they wouldn't look like human gods. They wouldn't even have the same attributes or the same kind of things. Because they're not evolutionarily instantiated to play the same kind of games we are instantiated to play. Or made to play, if you want to think of it like that. We won't get into that, but it's just the case that because you're a social creature, trust me, you tend to, whenever you're producing ideas, the first place and the basis for which those ideas are going to emerge is from the social persona architecture that is your mind. And so because it's like that, whenever we look out into the world and things go in our favor or not in our favor, we tend to ascribe some personhood to that. And where does that personhood live? Well, it's just wherever it makes sense, and with respects to the times or the context. And so first thing I want to say is this, I'm not I'm not somebody who believes in universal truth necessarily. I believe in objectivity, but I believe objectivity only exists within context. You can only have an objective opinion when the requisite context is established, because, well, life is complicated. Do I think people who believe or first conceive spirituality were wrong? From given our modern context, yes, but given their context, no, not necessarily. I mean, they didn't know, and it wasn't necessarily a bad idea. Part of the reason I don't think it's a bad idea, because I guess I'm more of a Hegelian in the sense where I think knowledge is a process. You need one thing to get the other thing. I don't think nothing spins out of a vacuum or springs out of a void. I mean, you need source material, and the very first source material was our own nature, and that stuff's kind of strange and funny. So our original descriptions of the world in comparison to our descriptions now that are more rationally centric and empirically based seem strange, but I don't think that they're necessarily inherently problematic. Without those things, we wouldn't have these things. You can't get one without the other. At least I don't think. Because all knowledge seems to have a genealogy, and this is what Jung was keying on when all knowledge and ideas seem to have a genealogy. Jung got this from Nietzsche, but this is what Jung was keying on when he was talking about the collective unconscious, and in that way, I mean, I'm okay with spirituality. Now, from a philosophical standpoint and a practical standpoint, do I like spirituality, or do I care for classical spirituality or whatever? The historical notions of spirituality? Not really. I don't think it's necessary. That's why. And, maybe I care to explain what I mean by I don't think that it's necessary. I'll first start with this. Let's see. All ideas and all knowledge has a point. Whether the person is aware of that point or not, it does. Because to me, I don't say that because I say that because it makes logical sense to me from the standpoint of human beings are truly tool-making creatures, and we use our the instrumentative rational-centric elements of our brains to come up with our models and our descriptions of reality. It's definitely the case that ideas and conclusions and knowledge in general is supposed to be some sort of tool. It's another kind of tool, and so I tend to evaluate them in terms of their purposes and their consequences. So their purpose and their consequences. What are they supposed to bring about? Do they actually bring that thing about? And how costly is it to have that thing around? Because I tend to look at things in terms of cost-benefit analysis. I mean, that's really the thing. Is there morality to me in the strict sense of the word? Yeah, but is there morality to me in the sense of the sacred? No, I don't think that. I don't think that there's anything sacred necessarily in the world. The reason why I don't think anything is sacred in the world, I'll say this, what my brain tends to treat as sacred is human beings. Human well-being and human solace. Human advancement and human achievement. Those are the things that I think are sacred. Those things matter most. People matter most. Nothing else matters as much as people matter to me, in my mind. Even if I don't actually even if I don't actually think that way, that's how I act. Even if I don't consciously think that way, that seems to be how I act and how I'm motivated to think about things. Yeah. Moving on. Anyways, spirituality from that standpoint is something that can be evaluated from a cost-benefit analysis standpoint. And so one of the things that spirituality is supposed to do is help sort out the individual. So when you step out into the world and you're a part of this fluctuating matrix of craziness, you need something that acts as a roadmap to direct you to true north or south or west or east or wherever the hell you're going. Part of the issue I don't like about spirituality, it's part of the thing I don't like about spirituality, and you can't really get rid of this. So, I'm going to put an asterisk beside this statement. is the fact that it has to sort out values before it ever comes to a conclusion about any one thing. So it has to assign north, east, south, and west before it's any kind of system or way of being or practice, any kind of map for a person. It has to already come up with those things before it hands the damn thing to the person. The issue with that is usually, from social biological standpoint, those things are determined by geographical region and temperamental variances. There's not like a sound, and whenever you're looking at life from a certain perspective, when you think of early humans in the sense that they didn't leave their geographies very much and they didn't meet people that were very different from them very often, that's wonderful. It's a very, very effective tool. But, that's a tool given to us by evolution. It's not one that we actually designed or came up with through trial and experiment and thought, which is pretty necessary for us to get the things that have the highest utility to them. Utility is not the point of life, but I'm just saying, whenever you make a tool, that's usually what you appraise and evaluate a tool with, is utility. I know many people are not going to like the fact that I'm shrinking or cheapening down spirituality to a tool, but you have to have some lens with which you're going to evaluate something, man. If you're going to actually evaluate something, you have to give yourself a basis to evaluate it. That's why I hate it when never mind. But getting into debates with people about this thing or that thing, about their spirituality or their religious belief, is very annoying, because whenever you get into a debate with somebody about something, what you are saying implicitly is that it is free to be evaluated. That's what you're saying, though. That's not what whenever you're debating somebody. Whatever is on the table is free to be evaluated under some lens and perspective which can be evaluated. You can't evaluate anything that doesn't have any dimension, that doesn't exist in our space-time continuum. That's not possible, man, and that's not a real debate. You can't really debate something like that, or think about it, because debating is just thinking. And so if you're going to keep something in a nebulous space and never put a framework on it with which you can evaluate it, then you'll never think about it. And if you don't want to think, then fine. But us people that like to think, we don't like that. We don't like that. So that I'm treating spirituality as a tool, because it has to, even if that's not the full description of what it is, and there's this numinous thing and stuff in the void or whatever, that's great. But in terms of its manifestation and the incarnation of it in its flesh to human beings, we're tool-making creatures, and we're tool-wielding creatures, so it's a tool for us in some capacity, in some form. And you know that from psychological studies. I mean, part of the reason why people are spiritual and religious is because it's very conducive to assuaging anxiety. I mean, that's one of its features. I'm not saying that's all that it does, but because it has that feature, we're just going to key in on that feature, that aspect of spirituality that tends to be like a tool, because it's an abstraction to some extent, and all abstractions are tools. All ideas and abstractions are tools. Now moving on from that, back to what I was saying about geographical variance and temperamental variances creating things. So one thing that you tend to notice is that as people tend to be more conscientious, and they're in arid, dry regions where there's not a whole heck of a lot of resources, they tend to be monotheistic. And I'm pulling this from Robert Sapolsky's work. They tend to be monotheistic. If you look at people who are in more tropical and rainforest areas, they tend to be polytheistic. And the number one thing that you notice with people, whether they're religious or they're spiritual, is that they're usually very high in agreeableness, or moderate to high in agreeableness. And this makes sense. And this is also why I know that it has something to do with our tendency to be social, to the fact that we're interested in things like spirituality and religiosity in the first place. Because spiritual and religious people aren't spiritual and religious because they like spirits and things like that, not necessarily, but because they're relational. They like the idea of relationships, And when you talk to, and I know I said I wasn't gonna talk about religion, but I just want to bring this in as an anecdote to kind of persuade people to see the point. When you talk to religious people about, particularly Christians, why they're Christians, they talk about their relationship with the good old Savior, Jesus Christ. It's about having a relationship with a guy. And so that should tell you something, that its personality, honestly, is a better predictor and indicator for how spiritual or religious somebody's going to be than anything at all. And in that way, I mean, I think that, yeah, I think it makes sense, or at least I think that I know why it's in the world. Let's just say I know why it's in the world. And it's because people fundamentally want some sort of relational connection to the world. People feel connected to the world, or they want to feel connected to the world in some meaningful and significant way. And that's because we're a bunch of agreeable little dolts to some extent. But, spirituality and religiosity has a negative correlation with IQ. Fortunately and unfortunately. Partly why that's the case, but it's not an extremely negative correlation, not a significant one. But if you have something like minus 0.1 or minus 0.2 in psychology, they pay attention to it, because typically you don't get very strong negative correlations. If you have a negative correlation, period, that's something that's interesting. It's not very strong, but because there are plenty of highly intelligent people who are religious and who are spiritual. And the reason they're like that is because they're freaking hyper conscientious and very agreeable. And conscientiousness and agreeableness account for religiosity and spirituality in individual. Religiosity is agreeableness and conscientiousness. Spirituality is agreeableness and openness. So spiritual people tend to be more open in the first place, meaning they experience loose associations. So they're very much prone to divergent thinking and all sorts of kinds of let's just say intuitive processings than your neurotypical person, and much more than your hyper conscientious person. Conscientiousness is a whole another story. We're not going to talk about religion right now, but those conscientious folks. But the open people, those are your spiritual people, and so they're very much more intuitive, let's just say, than the average person. And they're very agreeable. So from an MBTI standpoint, NFs, those are NFs. The NFs, the SFs are your culprits, man. Like, they're your spiritual folks. Like, that's where they come from. Yeah, and they like it. I mean, they're not all of them. I mean, there's plenty of NFs that are atheists and things like that, but they're more likely to have religious beliefs, and they're more likely to be spiritual. And even if they're religious, they're usually going to identify with the spiritual aspect of reality, God the Father and the Spirit and things like that. And just this wonderful relationship with our Lord and Savior. Yeah, and so that's the thing. And I mean, you find that everywhere. I mean, however, if you're disagreeable and open, you're an atheist. Typically. Disagreeable people aren't religious. You know why disagreeable people aren't religious? Because they don't put relationships as the number one single all-encompassing value in the world. And that's not something that people pick. So you have to be fair. People have to be fair in terms of how they evaluate people. It's why I don't really harp on people's behaviors and beliefs as much as I think I could, because I mean, people don't pick a lot of things. Like, they don't get to choose. I mean, life is quasi-deterministic, and so let's just say it was some fate that made it such that they have those beliefs. And we're not really going to not have beliefs like that until we have that kind of discussion, that there is a real human nature, and it has consequences. It has real consequences in terms of how it tends to view the world and the kinds of ideas and ways it tends to want to shape and construct the world, and its justification system for its tendency to want to see things in the world. that's part of the reason why there's no point in arguing with a person whether or not this thing that they believe or so on and so forth is true or not. If they're not willing to put some sort of evaluative perspective on it, and meaning we're going to consider this thing a tool, we're going to consider this thing a model, we're going to consider this thing a scientific theory, we're going to consider this thing, you know, poetry or something like that. You have to, or a literary device or something like that. You have to put something, you have to put a kind of lens or perspective on something at some point in terms of your own thinking or your own beliefs in order to really know if that thing is sound or valid. Because if you're just referencing yourself, man, it's not going to happen. Like, it's not going to happen. And this is why I don't believe in objectivity, because people are made to be objective, man. People are not really objective. People are a lot of things. There are a lot of things, but they're not objective. And so if you want to be objective, that's a game you have to play, like a lot of other things, which is why I'm calling spirituality a tool. Now my point is that all right, I'm not going to rag on it. But what I will say is I'm not spiritual and I'm not a Christian or anything like that. Part of the reason why, yeah, and I already started here. Well, okay, let me just get to the point then. It's ineffectual, quite honestly, in terms of what it's supposed to do because it's evaluatively based, and so it has to sort out those values. The issue is the values that it's sorting out are determined by, obviously, factors that have nothing to do with the truth, or nothing to do with what's most efficient, typically, or what makes the most sense from a pragmatic standpoint, or anything like that. You know, usually if you want to know, for example, how conducive the belief that children are great sacrifices to the great Lord Moloch, you should probably take some rat population and go and sacrifice the pups for a while to Moloch and see what happens to the rat population in that region. Or else, if you do it with your people group, you're not going to exist for very much longer, because if you kill all your kids, you don't have people growing up to make your population size dynamics, and so, or sustain your population, and so you go bye-bye. And so, you know, sacrifice and certain things like that should be a value, but, you know, what we sacrifice and things like that, that's an important thing to get right. But what determines people's tendency to pick the thing is circumstance, happenstance, you know, some kind of factor of history that's not privy to our contemporary eyes, and geography and personalities, man. And that's a really, to me, volatile kind of way of doing it. It's why there are people groups, you know, that don't exist anymore. It's why there's cities and civilizations that don't exist anymore, because they ran out some sort of game or some sort of program, you can think of it, and they didn't consult something outside of their own, you know, local experience. And this is the issue. Your local experience is not a description of the world. And your local experience is only a slice of reality right now, or like for your lifetime. But trust me, life is reality is a self-organizing system. It looks that way right now, but it's not going to look that way, you know, 50 years from now. And the evolutionary kind of strands that time continuum takes, and the way in which it shapes, in the way in which reality, you know, turns in on itself and keeps turning in on itself to make this thing you're seeing, you know, in the future, that is consequential. That is extremely consequential. And maybe you're not going to be around to see it, but man, you know, we're going to have to deal with it. So, you know, make better decisions. That's what I want. That's what I wish I could go back to the past and tell people. But knowledge is a process, so I don't get super annoyed by it, because it's a process. If you didn't have those crappy, you know, you don't need all the crappy ideas, but because we didn't have things where we didn't have the idea of objectivity for a long time, we didn't have this game where we could put different lenses and perspectives on things and see which ones are sound, or which ones actually do their job and which ones don't, you know, and keep around the good things. We keep around the good things based on a process of attrition, what tends to stick around the longest, which, you know, there's a bug in that system as well, because, you know, it has to ultimately do with values. That's why Nietzsche was interested in reevaluating values, because if you say that surviving and keeping things at where they're at, or consistent, or maintaining the status quo is the greatest value of all human values, then yeah, you keep your religious systems and your spiritual systems. The issue is, though, even if you make that decision, life is not going to allow you, reality is not going to allow you to do that. And you can see that right now in the church. I mean, or even not even in the church. The world changes, and reality changes all the time. We're finding out new things about the world. People are being born in different ways and expressing themselves in different ways that have very drastic consequences, partly because we have, well, the Industrial Revolution and various things like that has basically flattened infant mortality. And so you have more different kinds of people in the world now than you did before. Okay, so that's one thing that people have to keep in mind. I mean, life is changing. It is always changing. When you change one thing in this system, it changes all else. And I mean, I know I might sound like an NF saying that or something like that, or an INTJ by saying something like that, but I'm telling you, it's the empirical truth. It's what we honestly can tell and estimate from the world, man. It's a very, very sensitive system. And so when you change that thing, it's going to change the future. It's always going to change the future. It's always going to change what it looks like. That's why there's no point in predicting it to some extent. After a certain point, there's no sense in trying to predict what's going to happen. With certain things you can. I'm not going to get into that. But the point I'm trying to make is this, is that you can't ever decide that, playing to the status quo or keeping things the same is a viable strategy. It never will be. Because life in and of itself is made to adapt. Reality is going to always have its flux and its dips and its twists and its turns, and it's going to force you under a different set of pressures that is going to move you to a certain kind of end. Now, what that end might be is another kind of discussion and another kind of video. A lot of people say that there's not a point to evolution, but I disagree with them. I disagree. There's not a teleos, but there's a consequence to it. There's a very real consequence to evolution, man. Like, it may not be obvious to people, but there definitely is one. And for that, I don't like spirituality, because it tends to grab these values and keep them fixed. And reality is very much something that adapts, that it changes, and so those values have to adapt with the times. It's like this because we didn't have a sorting system for these things. Partly because we had the idea of sacredity. The reason, now I'm not gonna, alright, I have to tiptoe very lightly around this concept, because was the idea of sacredity useful? Yes, at a point it was useful. Very, very useful. Is it necessary and useful now? No, it is not. And so that's the rub. People don't pay enough attention to the world, partly because people don't know what to pay attention to. And so that's the issue, This is my thinking. The world needs to become more intelligent, from an objective standpoint, not any kind of bias or anything like that, because part of the thing that's going to be necessary more so now than ever before is for people to be able to be vigilant. I mean, and part of being vigilant is part of being able to be vigilant is the capacity to pay attention and having the capacity for abstraction and evaluation, being critical. And those are features of IQ. Now, you need some more of that, and I think, I don't know, there really isn't a one-size-fit-all kind of thing for this, but I'll tell you this, people don't really know what to pay attention to. And that's kind of the issue. Spirituality and religion tells people what to pay attention to in the world. It tells them what's valuable and things like that. But the issue the issue is with those systems, they're broken. Because what they say is this one thing's valuable, but they don't tell you that the world is going to change in terms of the structure of what can be a viable value. Because values always lead to actions. Whatever value you have, that's going to script the modus. Let's just say whatever values you have, that's going to script your thought. We have some innate values, things that we didn't get to pick just because we're the little crazy monkey things that we are. We have some innate values that we didn't get to pick, and so we're stuck with them. We're going to play them out no matter what. No matter if we want to or not. And we have some that just come with us as mammals, and we have some that just come with us as organisms. Like sexual selection, it's going to be around for a long time, people. It's never going anywhere. Unless we start making babies out of test tubes, babies within test tubes, And even then, sexual selection is going to be a thing, because whenever you're deciding, oh, I want this zygote, or I want this trait, or I want this gene, or I want this thing, or whatever, you're still doing the game of sexual selection. You're just doing it with an imaginary partner or something. When you say you want a kid with blue eyes, well, guess what? You're picking blue-eyed people in the world and saying blue-eyed people are better than brown-eyed people, or at least I prefer a blue-eyed person more than I prefer a brown-eyed person. That's the reality. It's just sexual selection. It's just another way of doing it. One thing I think is funny about human nature is that we think we can get away from our nature, but we really can't. We're stuck with it, man. We're so very stuck with it. But the issue is, because that thing is so freaking volatile, partly because we don't know much about the world around us, and the damn thing is always changing, is that we come up with pseudo systems of values that we can map onto ourselves that make it such that we're more likely to survive that environment and possibly even thrive in it. Who knows? The issue is that the environment changes, or we change environments, or we move to different places. But really, even if you stay in the same place, the environment's going to change over time. How it's going to change and what it's going to change to, who knows? But it's definitely going to affect you, because your being is outsourced to the world. The world affects your being. You are not just you. You are the world that acts on you as well. And so, that has its consequences. That always has its consequences. But people, we didn't know that for a very, very long time. We didn't know that for a very, very long time. So I have hope that the world is going to become more sensible about these things. I mean, I'm not expecting anything immediately. Why? Another reason why spirituality isn't effective is it prevents people from seeing the world as it is revealed, because it puts a script on what's revealed, or how to interpret the thing. And maybe sometime it's damn anxiety provoking for people, though. I know this, like not knowing what to think and not knowing what to believe is a very hard place for people to be. I mean, I'm very cool with ambiguity and not knowing what the hell I'm doing or what I'm thinking or what I'm going to do. People try to rush me to come to decisions about things like that, but I mean, I like living in limbo. But but living in limbo is not profitable for action, okay? So that's why, I'm managing it right now, but but that's why people don't like it. And two, people need to have some sort of consistency. And whenever you're whenever you're dealing with the unknown, you don't really know what's going to be consistent or not. But I would incline people to just, hang out in there, because what you'll find, I think, at least what I find, is there are things that are consistent in the world, that that the world is pretty much like this, even if you can't know for 100% that that's what the case is going to be. That's just what the case is going to be. The world is not completely relative. I can tell you that. Even if you don't believe in any particular thing, you will not think that the world is completely relative, unless you believe in moral relativism or some type of relativism. But the world really isn't relativistic completely. At least that's not a total description of the world. It's a bit relativistic. It's a bit objective. It's a bit of a lot of different things simultaneously at once. And many factors are coming together to make the world you see or you perceive. Your brain, that little wonderful, strange perceptual organ that it is one of them. So don't think that you're seeing the world as it actually is, man. We don't know what it is. We're a particular kind of animal. If you talk to a bat, if you could talk to a bat, you would see a completely different world. If you talk to a cat, you would see a completely different world. If you talk to a dog, it would see a completely different world. How we know that this is the case is our brain is modeled around our sight, and in particular, binocular perception. We share this with other primates, and we share this with birds of prey and other mammals, like dogs and like cats. But dogs and cats' brains are designed around the fact that they're olfactory based, that they live and intuit the world through their nose. Bats, it's obvious that they intuit the world through their ears. And fish experience the world through electromagnetic waves. They see an electromagnetic spectrum when they step out into the world. We key in on particular vibrations of electromagnetic spectrum. That's why we're sensitive to light and photons, and we can see color and various things like that. But fish, they see a completely different world than we see. And reality is, and because they have a different perceptual scheme, their perception of reality is different. I know people want to say reality is something outside of people and things like that, but you don't know, man. Like, I swear, you don't really know. That's an age-old assumption. I mean, like, a lot of things are age-old assumptions. I'll just say this. I'll just say this. What you perceive is a consequence of you and the world coming together. It's a marriage. So you cannot trust that, you know things. You cannot trust that you know certain things. You can only know what you can put a certain lens on to evaluate. And even then, you've already rigged the game to a certain conclusion. And so you can't be omniscient. We've known this for a very, very long time. You can't be omniscient. That's not possible. But you do have to rig the game, or else you can't play it. Like, you have to make some form come out of the void and amorphous, kind of thing that reality is, or else you won't know anything. And so in that way, you're trapped to ignorance for all eternity. But also in that way, you're trapped to knowledge in a way in which you wouldn't be able to know and are going to be able to save yourself. Because you make an arc, or because you get some wood and you smack something together, you have the capacity to be saved. Because you actually come up with a perspective or a lens to evaluate your beliefs and your ideas, you will be spared. Like, leaving things in, look at whatever. I'm just gonna leave it at that. I don't like sacristy, and so, people should think about that one. Anyways, yeah, so spirituality, there's a reason why it exists. It's an evolutionary phenomenon like many other phenomena. Your spiritual kind of people are very open, agreeable people, and spirituality's main component is relationality to the world. To me, as a tool for orientating the individual in the world, I think that it's ineffectual, and as a tool that helps people make sense of themselves or the environment, I think it's ineffectual. Orientating oneself is moving and doing things in the world, so in terms of ethics, I think that it's ineffectual. And in terms of morality, like what you should think about other people and what you should think about the world, your relation to the world, I think it's ineffectual as well. Partly because the values that are a part of all spiritual systems were determined by your biology. And as much as people tend to like to say that these things come because of some revelation or the inerrant word, or it's the inerrant word of God, it definitely comes from biology. And so if you want something better than your biology, well, I mean, it's not to say that biology isn't useful. So you definitely want to consult your biology, and you definitely want to consult your naturalness and your lived experience in the world, your phenomenology, how you actually experience the world. Science is not how you experience the world, so science cannot be a source of religion or anything like that. Like, even though people want to try to make it out to be something like that, can't be that. Can it inform our ethics and our moral systems? It damn well better. But I mean, I'll tell you this, that we can do it over again, people. Like, we always have the capacity to do it over again. I know a lot of people are afraid, and nobody thinks that it should be done because they can't see. Like, if I could shake people to get them to see, like, it's necessary, man. The time is near. The time is nigh for, like, it's very nigh for a change. Like, it's very nigh for a change. But anyways, I'll continue by saying that, all ideas and everything that you see in the world is just some person's idea. I mean, it's just some person's idea. I mean, A lot of times those people were smarter than you. But, you know, it doesn't mean that you can't begin to try to ask the question or get the ball rolling, man, like, because it's necessary. Like, it's so necessary. You know, people tend to only want to act when there's goddamn pure calamity on our hands, and, like, that's a problem. That's a very problematic part of human nature, partly because it doesn't want to pay attention. Because, you know, from an archetypal standpoint, all father beliefs, or the great beliefs, the source beliefs, are the representation of culture, or the logos, or the thing. And yeah, yes. I know you know where I'm going with this. That thing becomes stale. It always becomes stale, because anytime something becomes the center of the world and it never has to adapt to the world itself, what they don't tell you is that all father, that logos, that thing, lives in its own universe, and that universe is chaotic and it's changing always. It doesn't sustain the thing; it just exists there for everybody else, or everything else that lives in the universe, to have some light and some ability to move within a certain landscape. It just makes a domain or a territory of known reality. Well, maybe that landscape is going to shift and change so much that it threatens that territory and that reality. So you have to change that logos, or that idea, so that it can expand to new territory, or occupy a different kind of reality that won't destroy you, you know? But, you know, I digress. But that's where we're at. That's where we're at. So, yeah, that's my video on spirituality. I know I pissed off a lot of people, but I don't really care at this point. So, I said it, and, yeah, that's my video. Thank you for watching.